Bien, bonjour à tous. Je vous propose de démarrer la conférence d'aujourd'hui de Frith. And before starting, I think we should all thank you and thank Uta as well for this great series of conferences. It's been a very exciting month. Not just of conferences, but for many of us of private discussions, experimental design, new ideas. So it's really been a feast. And in recognition of that, the Collège de France, of course, has something for you. It is the famous medal. So I will, just like for Uta, we don't want any jealousy in the couple here. So I am offering you this medal from Guillaume Budet, and the picture of the Collège de France, and on the side is your name and the year that you gave this wonderful conferences. So thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
And now on to the science, the cognitive basis of hallucinations and delusions.
Well, I'm very grateful, Uta and I are both very grateful for having had this opportunity to stay in Paris for a month and spend a little amount of time talking to our colleagues and lots of other times going out and eating and so on. So the last talk will be about hallucinations and delusions in schizophrenia, and in part I'm giving a little history of my experiences and thoughts about this topic. So just to give you a little bit of background, schizophrenia is in fact one of the most common serious mental health conditions. Before they emptied the long-stay hospitals, schizophrenia occupied more hospital beds in the UK than any other disorder, partly because they get ill relatively young and stay ill. So the lifetime risk is about 1%, similar to that of rheumatoid arthritis. And about 3 or so years ago, somebody had estimated the annual cost of schizophrenia in the UK in terms of care and treatment was about £307 million per, at least that's per year, and in terms of lost production, about 1.7 billion. So this is clearly a very important disorder, and if we could find some solution to it, this would have a huge impact. And the bottom line is we don't understand it at all. So how is it diagnosed? It's diagnosed basically from reports from the patient of hallucinations, which are false perceptions, and delusions, which are false beliefs. Here is one example of the sort of thing a patient will say: if I breathe without other people, then they get stuck to me. I get stuck to people and the thoughts come through people. There are things I've learned just before I came in. It was so bad I could hear everybody in my mind. It's like being stuck on the same wavelength as people. So apart from being evidence of some kind of thought disorder, it's quite difficult to understand what he's saying, but he's clearly having strange experiences about hearing everybody in his mind and him getting stuck on the thoughts of other people. As a slightly more clear-cut example, I felt myself touched in such a way as if I were hypnotized, electrified, or generally controlled by some sort of medium or other will. This would be an example of delusion of control or passivity, which I will talk about much more in a moment. So to understand schizophrenia, I think we have to address the hardest problem that confronts 21st century science, or perhaps second millennium science. That is to say, the relationship between the brain and the mind. And let me give you an example of this link that we have to understand. Why does blocking dopamine receptors reduce the severity of hallucinations and delusions? So this is a direct effect of something in the brain on something extremely psychological and high level. And here is just to show off as an example of a study demonstrating this relationship, where patients were treated for 4 weeks, either with a placebo or with alpha or beta flupentixol, flupentixol being a fairly standard antipsychotic medication, but exists in these 2 isomeric forms, and the alpha flupentixol blocks dopamine receptors, I can't remember which ones, because we didn't know about it in those days, whereas the beta-flupenthixol has other effects, but it doesn't block dopamine receptors. And you can clearly see that both for ratings of severity of hallucinations and delusions, there's no difference whatever between the beta-flupenthixol and the placebo, but by the 3rd and 4th week of treatment, the people on the alpha-flupenthixol have considerably reduced their severity. And this is a proper scale going from 0 to 4. We haven't cut off the bottom. So how do we understand these sorts of relationships? And this is my approach. First of all, I want to look for the proximate causes of specific symptoms. I'm not going to explain schizophrenia. I want to explain specific symptoms in terms of cognitive and neural mechanisms. And I then want to look for common neural processes across a range of symptoms, so there might be a final common pathway relevant to schizophrenia as a diagnosis. And then I want to infer the phenomenology associated with these deviant processes. So ideally, this will not only give us some idea about the underlying physiology, but it will give us some insight into what it's actually like to have these symptoms. And the one I have concentrated on is the so-called first-rank symptom of schizophrenia, delusions of control, sometimes called passivity experiences. The first-rank symptoms were invented by Schneider, and he had a list of some of the symptoms of schizophrenia which he thought were particularly characteristic and not so much found in other disorders. And these are examples of delusions of control. The patient feels that his actions are controlled by external forces. Example, my fingers pick up the pen, but I don't control them. What they do is nothing to do with me. So notice this is a very ordinary action. And another one, the force moved my lips, I began to speak. This is pre-Star Wars, bear in mind. And these various first-rank symptoms, delusions of control, hearing your thoughts spoken aloud, thought insertion and so on, seem to involve a confusion between self-generated experiences and experiences generated internally. So I'm generating my own thoughts, but somehow I hear them spoken aloud. I'm making my own actions, but somehow I believe that they're being controlled, caused by alien forces. As an example, I hear my own thoughts spoken aloud. Note, this is not a problem with the control of action, but with the experience of action. So on the whole, their actions are fine, although there are some subtle differences I will show in a moment. So the question then is, if this is the case, the surprising thing perhaps is not that schizophrenic patients have this confusion, but why do we not have this confusion? How do we distinguish between self-generated experiences and experiences generated externally? When I'm speaking, I hear the sound of my own voice, but I don't think it's somebody else speaking. And the basic idea comes from Helmholtz, which is that through the motor commands that generate our own actions, we have prior knowledge of the experiences that will be created. And that's how we can make this distinction. And this is a very early attempt to talk about this in terms of the box and arrow models loved by cognitive psychologists before they discovered brain imaging. And essentially this suggests that there are two routes to action. You can either something happens in the environment and you respond to it, or nothing happens in the environment, but you have a prior idea and you generate your action. And it seemed as if the schizophrenic patients couldn't distinguish between these two kinds of process, and perhaps there was something with this monitoring system which monitored whether you had a plan, what action you did, whether there was something in the environment, and by linking all these together could work out why you performed this action. But then I met Daniel Wolpert, and he has a much more sophisticated engineering model which applies to motor control in general. And what he and his colleagues point out is that for effective motor control, given the delays in the system, you have to have something called a forward model. So in this case, what happens? You have a goal, you want to pick up the glass, you have to then calculate or make an inference about what motor commands you should send to the muscles in order to pick up the glass. This would be the inverse model. And on the basis of that inverse model, you can actually predict where your hand is going to finish up and what it's going to feel like. This is the forward model. And this is useful for various reasons. Firstly, because of the delayed feedback you're going to get, but secondly, because the inverse model is very difficult to calculate. There are an infinite number of ways in which this movement could be achieved, so it's mathematically difficult, not very tractable, whereas the forward model, once you've worked this out, the forward model is completely specified, so you can actually, without actually making the movement at all, you can say, if I did this, if I made these movements, what would happen? And if you find that what would happen is not what you want, you can go around this loop here and change it until you get the right outcome that you're expecting. Obviously, all this is happening unconsciously. But the more interesting bit is this here. The forward model predicts what's going to happen. Your actual movement into the environment produces sensations and feedback. And by comparing these, you can see whether what you expected to happen has happened. And if what you expected to happen didn't happen, then something is probably happening in the outside world that you haven't taken account of. But the critical thing here is this forward model that predicts what's going to happen when you make a movement. And there are two kinds of things you can predict. You can predict the location of your limbs in time and space, where it will be and when, and you can predict what it's going to feel like, or what it's going to look like, or even what it's going to sound like, I guess. And this is again an example of demonstrating that most of the time what we're aware of is our predictions and not what actually happens. So this is from Marc Jeannereau's lab. The task that this person here, with his appropriate 80s haircut, has to do is to move a cursor straight across the screen from this box to this target box. But the computer distorts his movement, so if he moves straight forward, what he will see on the screen is a deviation over to the right. So in order to hit the target, he actually has to make a movement slightly to the left. And what Fourniret and Jeannereau showed is that normal people are unaware of this deviation up to about 15 degrees, so they think they've moved straight ahead, even to the extent that if after they've made the movement you say, now make the movement again, and don't give them any visual feedback, they move straight ahead. They don't make the movement they just made. So most of the time what we're aware of is our prediction, not what we actually do. And this also explains why we can't tickle ourselves. This is a person being tickled and having an intense sensory experience. This is a person tickling himself and not having any interesting experience at all. And the reason, of course, is that when you tickle yourself, the system is automatically predicting what you're going to feel and cancelling this out, where somebody else tickling you, you can't make this prediction. And Daniel Wolpert has drawn it in this funny way because I'm shortly going to show you a system where you can couple the rods he's holding and the rod he's tickling with in various different ways to produce distortions. Like here. So this is one of Sarah Jane Blakemore's experiments. You move a robot arm with your left hand that records exactly your movements, feeds them into a second robot arm that tickles your right hand, and you can then introduce distortions between the movements here and the movements here, either in time, so the movements here could be delayed, or the movements here could be distorted in space, so they could be rotated 90 degrees or something like that. And if you just look at time, you get this very interesting result. This is when the robot is tickling you and you report an intense sensation. This is when you're tickling yourself. In other words, there's no distortion across the system. This sensation is significantly reduced. And this is what happens as you introduce time delays. So it's 100 milliseconds delay, a 200 millisecond delay. So with a 100 millisecond delay, the intensity goes up a bit, and with a 200 millisecond delay, it's as if you're being tickled by somebody else. And what is interesting is that the change in ticklishness experience is present even though you're not aware of the delay in the movement. But this is just, in a sense, confirming the model that it depends on this very precise relationship between what you do and what you expect to happen. So you can see this at the physiological level. Prediction permits the attenuation of neural responses to self-generated stimuli. So this is the tickling machine for use in an MRI scanner where you can't have any metal or electronics or anything like that. So this is the subject lying in the scanner like this, except on his back, with his hand like this. And there's a long wooden rod here and a box here which is carefully constructed so as to restrict the sinusoidal movements you can make. And you can either have the experimenter tickling them from the rod at this end, out just outside the scanner, or the subject tickling himself like this inside the scanner. And you have 4 conditions: a rest condition where nothing happens at all, the external condition where the experimenter is tickling the subject from outside the scanner, a condition where the person is moving but not touching their other hand, and a condition where they're moving and touching the other hand. So this is the self-produced stimulation. And what you can see is that there's a big effect in the secondary somatosensory area in the insula on both sides when you're being tickled. And this is dramatically reduced when you're tickling yourself. And in fact, there's no significant difference between actually touching yourself and moving your hand without touching yourself, suggesting that this response here has almost been completely eliminated when the same sensation is self-generated. So now we can test the hypothesis in patients with schizophrenia, particularly those with delusions of control. So the idea is that patients with first-rank symptoms should fail to predict the location of their limbs in time and space. Another study from Jeannereau's lab, where the person makes movements with his hand, and sometimes he sees his own hand in this screen, but sometimes he sees the experimenter's hand. And in particular, when they're making the same movements, the patients have great difficulty in distinguishing between their own hand and somebody else's hand, particularly when they're deluded compared to not deluded. The similar thing happens in the imagination. There's a very interesting phenomena that there's something called Fitts' law, where you have to tap as fast as possible between 2 targets, and the time you take depends on how narrow the targets are. So as the targets get narrower, you respond more slowly. But you can actually ask people to do this in the imagination. So you show them the targets and you say, imagine tapping 10 times, how long would it take? In normal people and patients without passivity experiences, there's a very good relationship between the time it actually takes and the time that they imagine it takes. But in the patients with passivity experiences, although their movements in reality are very similar to normal people, when they imagine it, they make much less distinction between the difficult task and the easy task, as if they're unable to generate the sort of time this task would take. And then, of course, the second thing is the forward output model. They should fail to predict the sensory consequences of their actions, so they don't attenuate them. So in some sense, they're abnormally aware of their movements. And this is the obvious one to do. The prediction would be that patients with schizophrenia can tickle themselves because they're not attenuating the response. And this is the study from Sarah Jane Blakemore, which she did in Edinburgh with Eve Johnston. So these are control subjects. This is the difference in sensation between self and other tickling. So this shows that there's a much greater sensitivity to somebody else tickling you than tickling yourself. These are patients without the relevant symptoms showing the same effect. The patients with the relevant symptoms, they show no difference in their report of ticklishness, whether they're tickling themselves or somebody else is tickling them. This is obviously a slightly problematic study, and it depends upon subjective report. And there might be problems here. So this is, in many ways, a much better study where we have a more objective measure of this attenuation, due to cleverness of Daniel Warpert. So in this is a force reproduction experiment. So the experimenter presses on your finger with a fixed force, or he probably uses a machine to press on your finger with a fixed force, and then you have to reproduce this force. So it's memory for force. And you can do this in 2 ways. You can either do it by moving this joystick, which controls this force transducer, so you move the joystick to produce the same amount of force on your finger, or you do it by pressing with your other finger directly. And in normal people, there's a very good relationship between the presented force and the matched force. This is when you're using the joystick. But when you actually do it by pressing with the other finger, you actually press 1.5 times harder. And the idea is this is because of the automatic attenuation. You have to press harder to produce the same experience of force. And you can do a nice little game with this phenomena that you can have two subjects and you press one of them and you say, now reproduce that force on your colleague, and they press them and they go back and forth, and they of course, because of this attenuation, they press each other harder and harder, and they get quite cross and they say, he keeps pressing me harder than I press him, and this explains why little children who hit each other rapidly get into a fight. It's also a very good way of getting into science because you can call the paper the neural basis of force escalation. The interesting thing is what happens with patients with schizophrenia, which Suki Shergill did, and basically when they're using the joystick here, they're exactly like the controls, but when they press with their other finger, in a sense they're more accurate. They show less attenuation, so they don't press quite so hard as the controls do. The problem with this experiment is that we don't know how it relates to the specific symptoms. Now, this is an even clever experiment from Tübingen, looking at the same phenomena, but in eye gaze, in slow pursuit tracking of the eye. So in this task here, you're following a target which is moving against a stationary field, which is interesting because as far as the retina is concerned, if you're doing this correctly, the target is stationary because you're following it, and the field is moving across the retina. But your perception, of course, is not that the field is stationary. The field is moving and the target is stationary. Your perception is that the target is moving and the field is stationary. So there has to be something in the brain, which is illustrated by the system here, which is using your eye movements to correct, to make sure that the background looks as if it's stationary by some sort of subtraction method. And in fact, we don't do this perfectly. So these people have developed a system whereby you can actually turn a knob until you reach the point where the background generally looks stationary, and then you find it's actually, you have to do this, it has to slightly move the other way or something like that. And so you can measure how much attenuation is being applied when you're successfully tracking the target. And again, they found that schizophrenic patients applied less attenuation, and this correlated with the severity of their delusion of control. So there's quite a lot of experiments demonstrating this rather specific problem. At the physiological level, at the neural level, there's much less evidence, but there is some suggestive stuff. So this is from Cornelius Weiler, which is simply showing that the difference between your arm being passively moved and you're actively moving it, as you would expect, there's more activity here for a passive movement than an active movement because of the lack of attenuation. This is Sarah Jane Blakemore's tickling experiment. There's more activity here when you're being tickled than when you're tickling yourself. And this is from Sean Spence's study of patients with delusions of control, and from, as I'm a psychologist, I think these are all in the same region, roughly speaking. And the Spence experiment was extremely impressive because he found this difference when he compared patients with delusions of control with normal subjects. He found it when he compared patients with delusions of control with patients without delusions of control. And he found it when he compared patients with delusions of control with the same patients when their delusions had disappeared. In all these cases, there is extra activity in this region in parietal cortex. And there's some suggestion, which is very shaky at the moment, that this is associated with lack of activity in frontal cortex, which comes back when the patients recover, suggesting that this might be where the signal comes from to attenuate this response. But this is very speculative at the moment. There's a similar phenomena in hallucinations, which I haven't talked about, but you can obviously have a similar explanation. There's something funny about when patients speak or think, they somehow experience this as coming from an external source. Is this due to a lack of attenuation? This is from Judith Ford's work, measuring ERPs to speech. And this is normal control subjects. And basically, when they're talking, responses to cues are damped down. So this is when they're talking, and this is when what they said is being played back to them. So there's a reduced response to their own voice. And this is much less, there doesn't seem to be the same difference in patients with schizophrenia, particularly those prone to hallucinations. And they also looked at connectivity or coherence using EEG, and there's much greater coherence between speech-generating areas, let us say, and speech-receiving areas in the normal brain compared to the person with schizophrenia, particularly those subject to hallucinations. So I think we're now able to answer the question, what is it like to have delusions of control? Because of these prediction failures, the sensory consequences of the patient's own actions are not suppressed. So active movements actually do feel like passive movements for these patients. And so it would seem reasonable that they should describe them in this way. Now, there have been more recent developments in experimental techniques for studying our perception of our own actions and our perception of agency. Because there are some problems with this account relating to, first of all, this lack of prediction doesn't seem to apply at really low levels. If people couldn't predict their movements, they would fall over all the time. They don't do that. It only seems to emerge when you have to report what's going on. It seems to be at the conscious level and not at the unconscious level, which of course fits extremely well with Stanislas's work demonstrating that these patients are fine in perception at the unconscious level, but funny things happen as soon as it emerges into consciousness. So maybe something like this is happening in the motor system as well. And of course, one that particularly Patrick Haggard has pointed out is the experience of agency, and being in control of your actions depends not only on prediction, but also on retrospection. It depends on what happens afterwards, because in a sense, experience of agency involves doing something and having a consequence, and you have to link these together to produce the experience of being in control. So our experience of agency is affected by the consequences of our action. And this is an experiment from Sinovchik and colleagues, again from Germany, where the subject is in this situation using force transducers and things where you can manipulate the force that they have to apply to make movements and also their visual feedback. So in essence, in one situation, they get false feedback, like in the Genero experiment, and they're asked to make movements and then to repeat these movements. You have to read it to really understand it. But in a sense, one thing you can do is you can measure how accurate the patients are at distinguishing between different movement intentions. And in terms of just noticeable differences, they're significantly much worse than the controls. So there's much greater variation in their prediction of where their hands are going to go. But in contrast, if you do a sort of adaptation experiment where they have to learn that in order to move straight ahead, they have to go slightly right or whatever it is, the schizophrenic patients actually do better than the controls. So in this case, they seem excessive. If you imagine there are two components, there's a prediction of where your arm is going to go, and there's a feedback about where it finished up. They seem to put much more weight on the feedback about where it finished up than on their prediction compared to normals. And so the argument would be because of their lack of prediction, they depend much more on the outcomes of their movements. And shortly afterwards, another paper appeared in Brain from Martin Foss and colleagues using Patrick Haggard's technique, which is a completely different technique, but I think in essence gives you a similar result. So this is specifically looking at prediction and retrospection. So the predictive component uses the phenomenon of intentional binding. So when there's a high probability that your action will be followed by a tone, they experience as closer together, and you contrast the situations where there's a high relationship and the situations where there's a low relationship. And the shrinking, the attentional binding measure gives you a measure of how much prediction is going on. And then there's the retrospective component, which is where 50% you press the button, 50% of the time a tone occurs and 50% of the time it doesn't occur. And what is interesting about this paradigm is that, and you have to say when did you press the button, the time that you say you press the button is affected by whether or not the tone occurs at the end. In other words, what happened after you press the button is affecting your experience. So this is the retrospection component. And basically, the schizophrenic patients seem to have no predictive component, whereas the controls have much smaller retrospective component. So again, it's showing that the patients seem to depend very strongly on what happens afterwards and not on what they expected to happen. So imprecise predictions about sensory consequences of action cause patients to rely excessively on sensory feedback. So in other words, they have problems combining information from two different sources, the expectations and the sensory feedback. So the next part of my talk, I want to go on to suggest how we might take these basic ideas and apply them more generally to the symptoms of schizophrenia. And this is where my favourite person, the Reverend Thomas Bayes, comes in, because what he said, of course, experiences and beliefs are created from the combination of prior expectations and new sensory evidence. In other words, the two components we've just seen seem to be falling apart in schizophrenia. So can a failure to combine expectations and experience provide a general account of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia? Now, according to Bayes, or according to my version of it, a belief is a model of the world based on evidence. The strength of my belief is an estimate of the probability that my belief is true, and I use my belief to make predictions about the world, and I update my belief on the basis of prediction errors, that is, new evidence. And this is an example of a belief. So perception depends upon its prior experiences. This is shape from shading. You expect the light to come from above, so you see 5 convex buttons and 1 concave button, but now you see 5 convex buttons and 1, you're now completely reversed. So what you see here depends upon your expectation, because the thing you're looking at is exactly the same. And this is Bayes' theorem, which basically says it calculates how much I need to change my belief about the world, that is the probability of A, given the new evidence X. And probability X given A predicts the evidence we expect given our current belief about the world, and this generates the prediction error that we can use to update our belief about the world. And what is interesting is this updating mechanism applies to perception as well as belief. This is the very fashionable ideas about perception at the moment in terms of predictive coding. Well, from a study of schizophrenia, the interesting thing about this formulation says there's no difference between hallucinations and delusions. It's artificial to say one is perception and the other is belief, because in fact the mechanisms are exactly the same. But of course, you can have a hierarchy of beliefs and prediction errors. This is due to Carl Friston. So prediction errors at a low level of the hierarchy, the evidence that is sent up to the next level in the hierarchy, and the priors at the higher level, sometimes called hyperpriors, constrain the possible explanations of prediction errors at the lower level, just as at the lower level you're constrained about what evidence you expect to come in from your senses. And the suppression of sensory experience during active movement is an example of how perception depends upon prediction. Perception is not a passive process. As I already said, the mechanisms underlying perception are the same as those underlying belief formation. So let me give you an example of this in reading, especially for Stan's benefit. Here are 2 simple sentences. Jack and Jill went up the hill. The last event was cancelled. You have no difficulty in reading those, I'm sure. And the way in the olden days this was thought to happen is you first have the shape, you go up to the next bit of the inferior temporal cortex and you get a letter, go a bit further forward, you get a word, and then you go even further forward, you get a sentence, and then you get a meaning. It's a typical feed-forward parallel device. But of course there's a big problem in the case of these 2 sentences, which I hope you haven't noticed, which is that these 2 graphic symbols are absolutely identical, but one of them you read as went, and the other you read as event. So how does this work? So let's see what happens. So somehow you have to decide, does this graphic string here mean went or event? You can't decide that bottom up, because it could go either way. But of course, top down, you know from the sentence that this has to be went and not event, because it wouldn't make any sense. So actually the expectation determines what this looks like. So you have, and in fact it's solving the hermeneutic circle, if anyone knows about that, because you can't read what's at the bottom until you know what's at the top. but you can't know what's at the top until you've read what's at the bottom. But the Bayesian system allows you to do this by this cyclical thing. This goes up ambiguously, and then it's constrained by the meaning, possible meanings at the top here. So this is an example of the prediction errors going up through the hierarchy. If you read this as event, when you get to this point, there's a prediction error, and then you go down and change it to went instead. This is an example, I think, of it happening in real life, as it were. This is the rubber hand illusion from Henrik Ehrson in this case. So this is the person, the volunteer's real hand. This is the rubber hand lying just above it. He can't see his real hand, he can see the rubber hand. If you stroke the real hand and the rubber hand in synchrony, there's obviously a discrepancy here because you feel it in one place and you see it in another place. And the brain resolves this by moving your real hand into the rubber hand, so you now feel and see the event happening in the same place, and you get the illusion that the rubber hand is your hand, and if you prick it with pins, you get a huge emotional response, but only when this illusion is in place. So a normal person can easily be made to experience a rubber hand as their own hand. So this is an attempt using this sort of circuitry in a very simplistic way to explain delusions and hallucinations. So this is, I don't know, what's the real situation? This is the person drying their hair with a hairdryer, and you have to see this and you work out what it means, and this is the sort of correct version. This would be a delusion where you see this, but the predictioner says there's something wrong here, and you say he can't be actually doing it with a hairdryer, he must be pointing a gun at his head. And this is the hallucination where your belief about this is so strong that you see this happening even when there's nothing there at all. So that's a very simple-minded attempt to explain what's going on. Now, this is another example, suggests that there is some evidence for this. This is the hollow mask illusion, where at this moment you're seeing the mask. Now you're seeing the inside of the mask, but you cannot help yourself inverting it, because you never see inverse masks. So as soon as it switches, you see it's inside, but now it looks like the face pointing outwards, and it reverses the other way. This illusion obviously depends on your prior expectation about faces being convex and not concave, but it's reduced after treatment with cannabis, and also reduced in people in the very early stages of psychotic episode. Again, consistent with the idea that their beliefs are being overridden by the sensory input. So what's the physiology underlying normal prediction errors? We know a little bit about this. Perception and belief formation of Bayesian processes depending on prediction errors, and we know that dopamine is linked to reward prediction errors in certain cases. This is the data from Wolfram Schultz, measuring activity in dopamine neurons. If you get an unexpected reward, that's a prediction error, the firing goes up. If you get an expected reward, there's no change, because the stimulus here says the reward is going to come, no change in firing. If you're expecting a reward and it doesn't come, the firing goes down. So the firing rate here is actually a prediction error, which is positive when it's better than you expect and negative when it's worse than you expect. And there is some preliminary evidence that there's something funny about this process in people with schizophrenia from these two studies here from Paul Fletcher's group in Cambridge. So this is a reward prediction error where the controls show this big difference in the striatum here between the two conditions, and the patients do not. And this is another kind of prediction error, and again the patients are failing to show the distinction between the two kinds of prediction error here. So there's, again, as I say, there's some preliminary evidence that something is going wrong at this very basic stage in relation to prediction errors and perhaps the dopamine system, which of course may link us back to the very first point I made about why is it that blocking dopamine receptors seems to reduce these symptoms. So what's the role of dopamine? The evidence provided by an error signal has two components, a magnitude and an uncertainty, analogous to a mean and a standard deviation. And dopamine release seems to be associated with reduced uncertainty, both in relation to expectations, for example, the placebo effect, and evidence, for example, reduced signal-to-noise ratio. So can this overactive dopamine lead to the creation of false error signals, i.e. signals in which we would not normally be confident because the precision is falsely reduced? And for example, effects of amphetamine, which is a dopamine releaser, produces grandiosity, increased perceptual clarity, which might go with this sort of account, but this is very speculative at this stage. So maybe having a sensory experience when making an active movement is an example of a false prediction error. And this false prediction error causes the abnormal belief named a delusion of control. And so the question is, can all the characteristic positive symptoms associated with schizophrenia be explained in terms of false prediction errors? And let me try and give you a metaphor for what this might be like. So what is it like to experience a false prediction error? So this is the dashboard of your beautiful old car. And although there's nothing wrong with the engine, a warning light appears on your car's dashboard. This is a false prediction error. So although your car has been very reliable, you now believe that there's something wrong with the engine. That's your false belief, first level. You take your car to the local garage, it's always been very competent. They find nothing wrong with the engine. You now believe that the garage is incompetent. So this is the second level false belief. And you can see how it would move up the system in this way. And this is a nice example from Peter Chadwick, who is a psychologist who actually had a severe psychotic breakdown at one point and has described this in great detail. And he says that basically he had to completely restructure the way he saw the world. So he said, I had to make any sense out of all these uncanny coincidences. I did it by radically changing my conception of reality. So I would say the false prediction errors, which were the uncanny coincidences, forced him to change his model of the world. In this case, he had to conclude that other people, including radio and television presenters, could see into his mind. So this is an example of these funny experiences creating this high-level false belief. So prediction errors elicit a change in our interpretation of sensory input. False prediction errors will be transmitted up a hierarchy of interpretation in an attempt to explain them away, and because they're false, they can't be explained away. And this leads to a fundamental restructuring of our model of the world. So that's the sort of very sketchy outline of how we might explain positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, what I have not talked about at all is the whole area of mentalizing problems in schizophrenia, which are increasingly of interest. Patients with schizophrenia are basically bad at theory of mind tasks. And I think this would fit very well from what I'm just saying, because communicating with others and understanding their intentions depends upon prediction errors, as you'll remember from last week's lecture. So false prediction errors will create problems with communication and mentalizing, which this most recent meta-analysis says seem to be common in schizophrenia and not explained by IQ or executive problems. So finally, what is it like to be paranoid? Communication is not quite right. People don't respond as I expect. People are hiding their intentions from me. There is a conspiracy against me. This seems to me what would naturally result from false prediction errors interacting with your attempts to communicate with people. So what my key message, meta-message as it were, is by developing models of the mechanism underlying perception and beliefs, we can create an account of the symptoms of schizophrenia which can be linked not only to the underlying neurophysiology, because again you could outline some sort of research program to look into more detail what is happening with these false prediction errors, but also to the experience of the sufferer. We can understand what it's like for them, and that again might feed into various kinds of cognitive therapies. So the key message, the cognitive level of explanation, is critical in any endeavour to link the mind and the brain, whatever the geneticist may tell you. So thank you very much.